That's a great question. And also, my lack of security background will show through here, but I'll give it a shot.
I love it how down to earth you are. Like you just basically do the entire security thing. Like, I'm not from security, people don't judge me.
Patrick,
I still feel new. Yeah.
Patrick is humble to a fault. I show up to work every day and I'm like, oh my gosh, this guy is incredible. I can't believe he's my peer. Don't buy it.
You're
Yeah,
too
I'm
kind.
like people who hang out with Patrick. I've hung out with both of you. That's why I'm like, he keeps saying I'm not a pet security person. I'm like, but I'm pretty sure most conversations we would have is like, dude, you sound like a pretty security person right there. If you're pretending to be one, you're doing a great job of pretending to be one. If you're thinking of building an AWS infrastructure to the size of Netflix while maintaining developer experience where you don't have to ask developers to do a lot of things and your security is seamless, that is the ideal present that some people at Netflix were able to create. And we had Patrick Sanders and Joseph Kjar from Netflix to share what they did and how they solved that problem while keeping developer experience in mind so that they could still do security without asking a lot from the developers. Now, this is one of the examples where a security is looked as an enabler, not as a blocker. As a huge proponent of developer first security, as well as going on the path of how do we make sure that we are able to security in a way that it's seamless, that people don't even realize that there is security going on in the background, or at least we have guardrails, not security gates. This was a great episode. And if you are someone who's probably interested in how engineering works at a large scale company like Netflix, or why is developer experience important for a company like Netflix, which works on a global scale, this is definitely an episode I would love for you to hear out. Patrick and Joseph did a great job explaining their thought process, how they worked on that IAM problem when migrating from the single account structure to a large account structure and then to multi-account, and what were some of the thinkings around why do we need to have identity managed separately. Now, that's enough of a hint for what the actual problem was they were solving. There was a lot of questions that came through as well that were answered by them. And I'm grateful that they were spending the time with us to share the knowledge and the learning that they had. If you are someone who's trying to be a cloud engineer or wants to become a cloud engineer who's solving problems that are at global scale, and that's my dog in the background, if you're watching the video, for people who are trying to solve a global problem or know are about to face a global problem, developer experience may be something that you might have to consider when you're trying to build solutions for your overall organization from a cloud perspective. And if you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, feel free to drop us a review or a rating. If you're watching this on YouTube or LinkedIn, thank you. There is timeline for the questions being asked. Definitely check out the timeline if you'd want to just go straight to the question. And if you have any follow-up, feel free to drop this as a comment as well. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will see you on the next episode on our AWS Build a Security series, which are running on the February of 2023. Talk to you in the next episode. Peace.
When you're developing an app, security might be treated as an afterthought. With functionality requirements and tight deadlines, it's easy to accidentally write vulnerable code or use a vulnerable dependency. But Sneak can help you secure your code in real time, so you don't need to slow down to build securely. Develop fast, stay secure. Good developer. Sneak.
Hey, Patrick. Hey, Joseph. Thanks for coming to the show.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
No problem. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Now, I'm super excited because I met you guys at the AWS event and you guys had a great talk over there as well. I'm so glad I could get you both onto the show as well. Maybe to set the scene and to start off, could you just share how did you guys get into the whole cloud security space? And Patrick, maybe you can start first.
Yeah, sure. So I don't actually come from a security background. I started my career doing some Navy contract work in Florida, and then I moved to Atlanta to work for a startup as a backend software engineer. And in that time, I got involved with the local B-sides and became an organizer and kind of started getting involved in the community and figured out that I actually really like this security stuff. And then one day Netflix came knocking on the door looking for a software engineer for the cloud infrastructure security team. And I was like, you know what? I'll interview. Why not? You know, just for the experience at least. And then I ended up getting hired, and I've been on the team for 3 years now, and I have built up a way more security knowledge than I had before, specifically around AWS security.
That's pretty awesome. And thanks for sharing that as well. Joseph, over to you.
Yeah, so I've been a computer nut my whole life, but it wasn't until around college that I started to take an interest in security. Even with that, my first job was not a security job. It was more of a systems administration type of operational role,
Mhm.
managing Windows servers, Active Directory, and a little bit of PKI infrastructure. And then from there, I transitioned into more of a traditional SOC role, doing incident response, building detections. And at that time, I was approached by my manager with a really awesome opportunity to kind of spearhead a lot of our cloud security efforts in the detections space and IR space. And so that was kind of my initial foray into it, and really kind of got hooked on it. And that led me to take the architecture role with Veracode security company, looking at all sorts of AWS security things within their environment. And so
Yeah.
ever since then, AWS security has been my focus, and that's what brought me to Netflix.
Awesome. And I'm so glad both of you are here for such a varied experience. Someone coming from a non-security background, someone from a sysadmin background as well. It's actually is a great breadth. Now, the topic being building AWS infrastructure with security and speed. Maybe I was going to start off with what are some of the, like, maybe the few things that you think of when you think about, like, AWS infrastructure with speed and security at scale? Are there like common, what's the word for it, like building blocks that you think are important for it? Like, I mean, clearly a skill team like yourself would definitely be a part of it, but what are some of the things that you, now since you've done, I'm kind of like starting from the back instead of starting to build from it, keen to know from you guys, like what are some of the top two things that come to mind when you think about building blocks for a, like, scalable AWS infrastructure? I think Patrick, you can go first if you like.
It's a hard question because there are so many pieces that that have to come
Yeah, and
together.
also like any two that kind of you feel, because I know we can't, because it depends on a lot of things as well. There are people depending on the application, blah blah. So maybe top two things could that come to your mind? Like, I mean, even the account structure itself is for me, like, don't even, like, I don't know how many people even know that you can have multi-account. People just think it's like, oh, I just one account for everything, and that's cool. All
Yeah,
right. Sorry, Joseph,
yeah,
you go first, man.
so go ahead, Joseph.
Yeah, I think it is an incredibly difficult and broad question, but I think one way to think about it is in terms of capabilities rather than necessarily building blocks, because there are many, many building blocks. But the core capabilities a lot of times boil down to the ability to deploy stuff, right? I need to provision workloads, I need to run things in the cloud. And on the other side of that, governance, right? I need the capability to exercise some degree of control over what's happening in that environment in order to meet my security risk and oftentimes regulatory requirements. So every business is different in terms of what their requirements are within each of those realms, what they need to build, what they need to deploy, and what their governance or their approach to governance is. But in my mind, those are kind of the two overarching capabilities, and the building blocks you pick really are derived from your requirements in each of those areas.
No, that's awesome, man. Patrick, you had something to add as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Joseph said it really well, and you'll see this throughout this conversation that Joseph will definitely be able to flex his security background more than me, which I think is
you're
why.
important too, man.
No, I think it's why we work well together, because I have a different background than Joseph, and we can really team up and tackle a lot of problems. So for me, coming from a non-security background, I think that it's really helpful to just be really familiar with what you're trying to protect and what your risks are. And then from there, you can start to figure out, where do I need boundaries? Where do I need to make sure things can't cross over and, end up being exposed or, in the wrong hands internally and things like that. So that's kind of an abstract approach, but it's been really effective for shaping my thinking of which problems are important to solve.
Yeah. Awesome. And I've got a question here from Danielle Nadeem as well. Do you prefer having a separate account for IR teams, or should be baked into a regular production account, specifically for things like forensic? Any thoughts on this?
As you'll see later in this conversation, we believe in having as many accounts as possible. So just generally, I think that it's nice to be able to separate things by accounts. Joseph, what do you think?
Yeah, having a dedicated IR/forensics account can be a really helpful practice. Of course, you will need to have some sort of mechanism enabling IAM principles from that IR account to access all of your other organization's accounts and get the data or things that they need out of there and into that environment. But generally, it's very, very helpful to keep it separately, because then you never have to worry about people stepping on each other's toes or things happening to resources that are critical for maintaining an incident response timeline and the very strict auditing that goes along with that, compared to like a shared multi-tenant account where everyone's doing stuff all the time.
Yeah. And I think to your point is also helpful from maintaining a chain of custody as well for when it started and what happened at that point in time. If you're already there, your chain of custody is already compromised, assumed to be compromised already. So there's no point kind of having it in there, right?
Yeah, and I've seen use cases as well where certain organizations will actually spin up dedicated accounts per incident, especially for forensics type use cases where they're copying like compromised images of compromised instances into that account. They want to make sure nothing has ever been in there that's not specifically related to what they're investigating. All sorts of different patterns, but in general, yes, good idea to have that as a separate capability.
Yeah. Yeah. And thanks for that question, Daniel. Feel free to ask a follow-up question if you have one. I think that's probably a good segue into what I would kind of lead this conversation towards as well. The whole idea, maybe we can start off with the blanket statement that I made that, hey, maybe a single AWS account is not a great idea, considering a lot of us started, like, well, I imagine Netflix has been in this AWS for a long time. Like a lot of us, everyone started with one single AWS account, then you add more, then it becomes hard to manage. Then AWS releases AWS organization, and then there's the whole concept of organization now. And because they don't charge you for accounts, you can just keep adding them. I feel like maybe a good place to start building this could be if we just start up over here. It's a hypothetical startup, but at least that would help people of all different business sizes kind of figure out how do you scale. Because I think we're talking about building AWS infrastructure for speed and security, but my intention would also be to be able to scale like a small startup called cloudsecuritypodcast.tv into like a big behemoth, like a social media site for cloud security people. I just made up a company over there. Actually, if someone starts a company, this is where the first announcement made up.
Are we doing this? Is this what we're doing?
I know.
Now?
I'm like, maybe I should do this. I think that'll be a great idea because we have cloud security advocates. Maybe we should become a whole social media space for cloud security people. But considering we're in stage one this year in 2023, actually, I've got another question as well from Vineet. Do you use like non-prod and prod accounts for resources? I think we're going to answer something similar in a bit later. I'll pin this for now because I think I have a question specifically for, do you consider two root accounts in different AWS organizations like dev and prod? This is kind of where people kind of get into fights, man. So
yeah.
Joseph has some thoughts as well.
This one, I think we can take pretty well though. Avoid having to manage separate AWS organizations if at all possible. Right. You may be in a situation where you've had a big merger or something like that. But as a rule of thumb, avoid trying to have multiple AWS organizations. It's a very, very messy thing to try and manage.
Yep. And Patrick, did you have some thoughts as well?
Nope. Can't say it any better.
Awesome. I was going to add one more thing as well. I think a lot of people do this where if in case the concern is coming from having multiple root accounts within the same organization, I think AWS SCP allows you to block root account access or have an alert for it as well. Maybe if you feel that your concern is coming from a root account, you can probably use that as a way as well. There is a follow-up question from Danielle as well, which is how can we ensure that dedicated IR account is secure and audited, as the IR account, if compromised, may also have a lot of admin permissions to do bad things in the environment. I think you kind of answered it with the whole per incident, you just spin up a new resource rather than having it always on. But did you have any additional thoughts on this, Joseph?
Yeah, in general, the amount of usage that your IR account will have is generally extremely low. So it's pretty easy to audit. Like if you're looking through the CloudTrail logs associated with your IR account, the volume of events in there isn't going to be anything near what your dev or production accounts will be. And so it becomes pretty easy to implement detections and other auditing mechanisms to ensure that you know what's going on in there and are alerted if that account is misused.
Awesome. Anything to add, Patrick?
I think that it's worth mentioning service control policy here too. You know, if you have a good organization setup, then you can create policies at the organization level that can't be modified by any child account with some asterisks.
Yeah.
And you can use that to protect the assets in the IR account or in any account for that matter.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for that. And Danielle just said thank you as well. So that's question answered. And I think we need to just thank you for your patience. We'll just come back to your question as well. So we're building the startup, Cloud Security Podcast.tv, which is just a podcast at the moment. We're going to take it all the way to a social media company like Facebook. So what would be the first thought process for people trying to build, I guess, the first version of Cloud Security Podcast.tv? Single AWS account, possibly, but what's the thought process there to start building the product that this is?
Yeah, in the year 2023, I believe that there's no reason an organization should start with a single AWS account, unless that single account is your organization root and you immediately start making more accounts to actually do things in.
Oh, fair enough. Yeah. Well, actually, but why is that you recommend multiple accounts?
It's once you end up in a situation where everything is built in a single account, even with a very small company, the longer you go with that, the harder it will be to unwind because you get certain types of resources in this account that are impossible to move, like an S3 bucket. You can't migrate that to another account. And there are some other types of resources that are just really difficult to move around. Also, kind of separate from that, you want an isolated account to be your organization root. You don't want your production account to be your org root because you can't apply service control policy to the org root, so you can't protect your production account. So one of the tendencies that I see is that a company will start, have a single account, and then they're like, oh, AWS organizations looks cool. Let me turn that on in this prod account. And that is when things start to really go wrong.
I laugh because I've been in one of those companies. And I'm like, oh my God, that's a nightmare waiting to happen. You said it right. Sorry, I'll let you finish your thought.
Yeah, I'll stop there. Joseph, do you want to add in some?
I mean, amen to all of that. It just gets really, really, really ugly the longer you go with a single account. So if we were starting this startup today, we would definitely be building out a handful of accounts to get up and running. And AWS has published a pretty good white paper outlining best practices for multi-account management. And as part of that, they explain kind of your handful of core accounts that you should start with. And so I'd point people to that. I don't have a link right off the top of my head, but it's relatively easy to find. And that'll give you a good idea of, okay, these are the bare minimum things that I want to separate out, even from the very, very beginning.
Right. And because that kind of goes to the question that Vineet was asking over here as well. Like, would you say then non-prod and prod accounts for resources should be separate, or would you just have them like, hey, you know how like a lot of people have different ways of, in your talk as well, you guys had this thing where it was like the account structure for organization unit was set in a way that it's like a pool of a collection. Whereas a lot of people tend to just go down the path of saying, I'm just going to go, hey, I have a business unit HR for looking after all the new cloud security advocates coming in. And they would just be able to just go in and use that. So I want to have a HR as a separate one, my finance as a separate one, versus, it's the entire company with one product, dev in one account, prod in another account. There are multiple patterns to this, but do you find, is there a pattern that you normally recommend for people starting today?
Yeah, the test prod distinction can get pretty nuanced with how people manage their deployments. But generally speaking, yes, it's a good idea to have separate accounts for test and for prod.
Yeah.
And as far as the OU structure goes, I think that's a very, very interesting conversation. As you're scaling up your company or your AWS environment, how do you organize accounts into organizational units within AWS organizations? And the knee-jerk reaction to solving that problem is often to copy your org chart, but it's not effective. Your org changes way too often, and it doesn't align with the purpose of OUs in the first place, right? An OU exists as a vehicle for applying policy. So when you're trying to decide, do I need an OU for this or not? Should I organize my accounts into an OU in this way? You can ask yourself, does this group of accounts represent a unique policy need in my environment? If so, an OU makes sense. If not, probably, find another way to manage that grouping.
Yeah, because to your point, I mean, it's a logical representation anyways. It's not like you actually have, like, unless they were starting to give owners of each OU, because technically that's kind of where a lot of people just basically struggle when accounts don't have an owner, and doesn't matter what OU you put them in. It's just for us, we're putting them in HR business, but for everyone else, it's like, I don't know. I don't look after this. I'm not HR, so might be a different conversation. Anything to add there, Patrick?
I think that one temptation that leads people to mimicking their org chart with their OU structure is to use it to inform like billing and cost tracking. And that's not something that we deal with so much. So I don't really have good recommendations on that specifically, but I know that there are other approaches that you can take. So just something to consider when you're thinking about your OU setup.
I think that's a fantastic point. A lot of the needs that people try to use OUs to solve for, like Patrick is saying, are really more asset inventory and account metadata type concerns that are best managed in using a separate system. So, not to get too far off track, but for example, at Netflix, we built our own AWS account inventory system to keep track of our accounts, record metadata about them. I know plenty of other organizations have done the same. Highly recommend that as a way to solve some of those problems Patrick was alluding to and avoid falling into the OU trap.
Fair enough. That kind of ties in with a question that came in with how do you ensure visibility into AWS organization CSPM tools, or what's your thinking there?
That's a great question. And also my lack of security background will show through here, but I'll give it a shot.
I love it how down to earth you are. Like you just basically do an entire security thing. Like, I'm not from security, people don't judge me.
I still feel new. Yeah.
Patrick is humble to a fault. I show up to work every day and I'm like, oh my gosh, this guy is incredible. I can't believe he's my don't buy it.
I'm like people who hang out with Patrick, I've hung out with both of you. That's why I'm like, he keeps saying I'm not a pet security person, like, but I'm pretty sure most conversations we would have is like, dude, you sound like a pretty security person right there. If you're pretending to be one, you're doing a great job of pretending to be one.
Okay, well, I'm faking it really well, so I'll just stop saying that.
It really well. All right, I'll just answer the question then.
So this is going to be a pretty Netflix-specific answer because that's where most of my experience is. So this is where we use some automation tooling to make sure that we have, for example, event bridge rules set up to centralize all of our CloudWatch into our security accounts. And then we use SCPs to make sure that none of that can be modified by anybody who isn't our team. So I think that that's kind of a core piece, is to get your data flowing where it needs to be. And then from there, you can hook it into some kind of SIM or whatever solutions you end up choosing. CSPM tools are great. There are a lot of really great ones out there. Unfortunately, they don't fit our scale or our use cases very well. So we don't really have much insight into or I don't, at least. Joseph might from previous gigs.
Yeah, I've used a couple of the CSPM tools before, have experience with Dome9, Redlock, now Prisma Cloud. And they can definitely be helpful. I think the challenge with visibility in this case is that what you're looking for is so broad. When we say visibility into our AWS organization, there are so many critical slices of that, and each slice may require a bit of a different approach or solution. So if our visibility need within our AWS org is specifically audit trail, we want to know who did what, where, and when. Right now we're talking about CloudTrail. How are you going to centralize collection of your CloudTrail logs for all of your accounts, ingest them into something that makes them consumable, and then start doing stuff with them? Are you more interested in visibility of workloads themselves within your organization, right? You want to know what apps are doing. Well, this is all of a sudden a very, very different conversation. So I think being very clear about your requirements for exactly what you're looking for can really, really help when it comes to looking at the vast landscape of security tools and services available to choose, which path actually fits your needs best. Because there are many tools, all good at solving pieces of that pie, but the piece that you need is probably fairly unique to you.
Actually, that's a good point, because a lot of the conversations are easily diverted to what the marketing is saying, where you need a CSPM tool, you need this, you need that. And this probably would be a good thing about the whole developer experience as well as you kind of scale a company. But I think, so I hopefully that answered your question as well, Francisco. I've got another comment here. I was more concerned about asset inventory, stale, unknown resources. So, I think that kind of we still answered the question, I guess. So maybe if that's the way to structure it, that's the goal you're going with, maybe some of the form visibility might help as well. I'm almost saying it was a good practice to segregate the workload into cloud environment as it is suggested by AWS well-architected framework. Yeah, I would agree to it as well. I don't think anyone's going to disagree with that. To comply for PCI control requirement, how do you implement FIM in AWS? File integrity management. I don't know if any of you have experience in this to answer that question.
Are you referring to like on instance or to like in S3 or some other data stores, like cloud native data stores?
Maybe do you want to just share whatever you whichever you have the thoughts on, I guess, maybe that way.
So I have the most experience on the on instance file integrity monitoring, and we used to use a vendor product for that, but it wasn't scaling very well. So we ended up switching to something based off of OS Query. So we're able to do stateless file integrity monitoring, and it's been looking good so far. And it's all built off of open source technologies, which I think is really cool. For S3, I don't really have much experience with that.
This also, starts, I think, going into a different security domain than like some of the account architecture type stuff that we're talking about today, though it is an interesting space. And so don't want to make you feel, that we're just dismissing it outright.
Yeah, of course. And I think a good point as well. All right, so we're building a startup, just going back to the actual startup that we're building. And now we're scaling it up as well. So just to scale up to a multi-account structure, as you guys said, in 2023, we should not be thinking of a single AWS account, to thinking of multiple AWS accounts. So what's the approach? What's the step 2 here as your kind of company is growing? I've taken your multi-account strategy and I've gone, okay, I think we are at a stage where we were a social media company doing this podcast. Now we have a community we're building, so new products coming in. Well, sounds like it's a good idea to begin with. What are some of the layers that I would have to think about from a multi-account perspective that you think would help kind of, go to that next scale? And maybe Joseph, do you want to go first on this one?
Sure. So if I had to identify those layers, as you put it, as I'm scaling up, I think I would say you need to solve compute, network, data, and identity, right? Those are kind of the key layers that are going to span your accounts, and they're going to inform all of the design choices that you make in terms of how you manage your multi-account infrastructure. And the way that organizations address each of these domains is vastly varied. There's probably infinite variations on how people choose to address each of those things, but putting together a cohesive strategy for how you want to scale each of those layers as you build out more and more accounts, I think is absolutely crucial.
I do want to just plug real quick that we have some really incredible teams at Netflix. And I mentioned this during our reInvent talk too. There's so much of this stuff that we already have a really great foundation on. So we've been able to really push the envelope in how we approach multi-account architecture. And I think that we've come up with a really fascinating solution to bring better isolation to our workloads.
Oh, awesome. So wait, so you know how we kind of touched on this earlier as well, where we could have accounts like, what if I started off with one basic account for everything because I clearly didn't have access to Joseph and Patrick. And I decided to just go down the path of one account for everything or one ring to rule them all. And now I've kind of gone, I think I heard Patrick and Joseph talk about the advantages of multi-account. What are some of the challenges you find? Because kind of there could be many, but are there any top 2 or 3 challenges that you think of that people would face in moving from a single legacy account kind of structure to now multi-account, organization-led, multiple organization unit kind of structure?
Sure. So there are kind of 2 classes of multi-account problems, but from the question that you asked. One is, what are things that are inherently difficult about multi-account? And then the other side of it is, what makes migrating to multi-account from like a single or few very big ones, what makes migrating hard? So in general, multi-account is hard because it does increase resource sprawl. There are more things in more different places. It's hard because it increases, in some ways, your operational overhead. if you're not very careful about how you do it, processes might become more difficult. Other, challenges associated with migrating, because accounts play such an important role in access schemes within AWS, migrating applications or workloads from one account to another one, for example, as part of a multi-account initiative, is very, very, very painful. You have to fully unwind all of the access dependencies that application relies on, make sure that you rebuild those in the proper way so that it will continue to work in the other account. And that's just one of all the challenges you have to solve for this one workload, right? You also need to figure out its networking, its resources. Like, is it using or depending on things like a shared database in the account where it lives today? All of those things have to be unraveled, solved, addressed, tested, validated. Like, it's a process. And to have to do that for, potentially hundreds of applications as your organization grows, it's just remarkably difficult. Netflix tried it. We were not successful.
Right. Wow. And wait, so to your point then, multi-account is still good, even though there's a resource sprawl. There are challenges with it, but it's not a challenge that cannot be solved, but it just requires time.
Yeah, and I think that now is an important time to bring up, why bother? Why are we even
good
talking
point.
about why multi-account is so good? And for our particular situation, we have just a big old pile of risk in our one big account. We have all these operational risks with service quotas and rate limit exhaustions and things like that. So if one application is doing something bad, it can affect the availability of other applications. There's it's really hard to control access the right way. So we spend a lot of time putting together all these IAM policies that are trying to narrowly focus in a least privileged way for each application. So instead, we just said, what if we can split out these applications into their own accounts so that they can have pretty open access to all the resources in their own account, and then everything else has to be explicit because of the cross-account boundary. So you need the two-side policy updates to allow access to an S3 bucket in another account, for example. So it really just changes the shape of the risks that we're dealing with, and also basically eliminates the rate limit and service quota issues, except for really large applications.
Yeah, and to build on what Patrick was saying, it's like we really want these benefits of separate accounts, the scalability, the security isolation, the developer speed that we gain by virtue of being able to grant them more access in these tiny isolated accounts, right? We want those benefits, but how do we capture them without taking on those burdensome migrations that I was talking about earlier? And so, to what Patrick was saying, it was, how can we move each application to its own account without having to bring all that cruft along with us? And that's kind of the secret sauce behind the talk that we gave at reInvent this year, was basically finding a way to bring just the application identity over to the new account.
Yep, I think maybe we should time to get into that as well. But quickly going to address one thing that came up is cost effective with multi-account from Roderick. I think accounts are still free as of 2023. In case you ever hear this in the future. But as of February 2023, creating accounts is free in AWS. You can have as many as you want, as long as you can manage them, I guess. They won't tell you to manage them, so they'll just tell you to keep creating them. Kelsey, you guys want to add to this statement?
Yeah, I would say that cost isn't a direct factor, but it is very much an indirect factor. And the cost of building tooling to manage all of your accounts and manage access to accounts and everything like that is not negligible. And that's part of why our team exists at Netflix, is to handle those concerns.
Oh, awesome. Thank you for the question as well, Roderick. I guess, Joseph, to your point about the unique approach you guys took about bringing identity of the application, could you just walk us through the thinking over there and how did you guys solve that, the whole IAM proxy and everything? So that'll be awesome. And maybe Patrick, feel free to just drop in gems as you do in between.
Yeah, sure. So I think I kind of laid the foundation of our thinking going into it, which was, how do we capture the benefits without the insane pain of full-blown migrate everything out. And so in asking ourselves that question, can we isolate application identities and move just those things out? It really got us thinking bigger picture about managing those layers that we talked about earlier, right? The compute, network, data, and identity. So in this case, the way we're choosing to approach the identity layer is put every application identity in its own account.
Mm-hmm.
Now, to go along with that, we wanted to keep our compute and network layers centralized because we figured that splitting those pieces out into multiple accounts really is what led to some of the most painful and challenging parts of our failed migration in the past. So we wanted to leave those things where they are. We have robust platforms that manage that infrastructure. Let them keep doing their thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then as far as data goes, that one is still like less solved, I guess, on our part. But we also like the idea of keeping shared data centralized and controlled while still granting application owners and workload owners the freedom to manage data specific to their applications in whatever way that they deem the best. So when this led to some really interesting technical challenges, because if I have an EC2 instance running my application in a prod account today, how do I all of a sudden magically make it so that its instance profile, its IAM role, all of a sudden lives over in this dedicated separate AWS account?
Yeah.
That's not something supported by AWS out of the box, but led to some really fun engineering work, which Patrick can talk at length about.
Yeah, this is where I've been spending most of my brain time over the past almost year, I think. So the problem was that we needed to get credentials from a different account onto an instance in one account. And we didn't want to make our application owners update code or assume a role during their app initialization, because that would be just an impossible migration. We would have to make every team at Netflix make a change, and that's not something we like to do. So instead of that, we said maybe there's a way for us to just kind of get in between the application and where the application gets its credentials. And where the application gets its credentials is the EC2 Instance Metadata Service, or IMDS.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens is the AWS SDKs know to look for a certain IP address and a certain path to request credentials from at runtime from the IMDS. So what we decided to do is to intercept those requests with a small proxy and then replace the returned credentials with credentials that we get from doing an STS assume role with web identity. So using an OIDC token that's issued by our identity management system. So the effect of that is that with no change from the application owners, we can decide which role an application should get credentials for at runtime, which means that we're no longer stuck in the same account where the instance lives. We can use any identity that we have a token that we can use to access.
Right. And because how there are different kinds of identities in AWS as well, a lot of people going down the path of IAM users as well. Does this work for IAM users as well, or is it only for IMDS?
I mean, you could technically use it for IAM users, but you shouldn't.
Joseph, like, nah, don't use this approach for IAM users.
Yeah.
So to your point then, and this is a good problem to talk about from an EC2 instance perspective as well, the use of IMDS, a lot of people would not even know like what it is and why is it used for. Why is it important in this context? Like, I think because you mentioned IMDS, you can talk about the whole temporary credentials and everything as well if you don't mind. Why is it important on IMDS, and why not just do extension of IAM user or extend the user of Ashish over to the other end?
Yeah, that's a good question. So if we decided to use IAM users, we would basically be making a commitment to have static long-lived credentials somewhere in our infrastructure for every application. And we are allergic to that. That's not a thing that we're okay with. So the benefit of using roles and getting temporary credentials through IMDS is that those credentials are temporary. They live for 1 to 6 hours or somewhere around there, depending on how you have things configured. So by using temporary credentials, if a credential does get compromised or leaked somehow, it's only useful for the lifetime of that credential. Whereas with IAM user credentials, if that gets leaked, you now have to deal with a key rotation, and you probably don't know all the places those credentials have ended up, and you're going to break something almost definitely.
Yeah. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, like just to try and bring this home for people, because it's kind of a hard thing to explain, without a whiteboard and really like
Yes, I
sitting down
agree.
and like going through it all. Like imagine that you're launching an EC2 instance in the AWS web console today, right? You're clicking the buttons, create, launch an instance. I want like a T2 micro server or whatever. There's that option to select an IAM role, right, that you launch your instance with. Whether you're using the command line or the console or the SDK, however you want to do it, that IAM role today has to live in the same AWS account where you're spinning up your compute instance, right? You can only pick a role that lives in that account. So you pick it, you hit go, instance deploys. What's the significance of that IAM role, right? Well, that IAM role is what governs that instance's entire security model. The things that EC2 instance is allowed to do are all tied to that IAM role.
Yep.
Going down one step farther, well, if I'm running my application on that EC2 instance, how does my application gain access to do things like get an object out of S3? Well, it has to get credentials from the instance that it's running on. And how does it do that? Through the IMDS. So that's kind of the like top to bottom chain of how it works today and where we've decided to insert ourselves, right? So with this approach that Patrick just outlined, now when the application goes to get credentials, we're not forced to give it the role credentials from that same account. We can give it credentials from whatever account we want. And by doing so, completely change the security model for how these applications run, what our risk is. If that application is vulnerable and gets popped by, a bad actor, now the purview of what they can do with that application's AWS credentials is entirely different. So it just changes so many conversations about the risk posture and security of our environment. And so it's been really, really exciting.
What would be a security benefit to your point, because the IAM role itself is no longer limited to the account? Because a lot of people might just go flip and go, doesn't that extend the permission? Because you can get anything you want, isn't it? Like, so where or how do you manage that expectation, I guess? Because when people ask you that, doesn't that open up to the entire world? I can go to Ashish's account, to Patrick's account, to Joseph's account, to wherever I want. Like, what's the thinking there?
So what we have right now in our big multi-tenant account is, although we've put a lot of work into least privilege and have spent so much time and engineering effort trying to solve that problem, it's still not perfect, and it never will be realistically. There are going to be identities or roles that have access to resources that they don't need access to. And that just kind of happens over the years as policies change and, teams churn, and everything is different over the course of 14 years we've been in AWS now, something like that. I don't know. So instead of trying to do the really tedious work of coming up with the right guardrails or the right perfectly scoped identity and resource policies to try to solve that in this one account, by using an identity in a different account, it kind of hits a reset button. And that identity no longer has any implicit access to other resources in our big multi-tenant account. But if it still needs access to an S3 bucket that it's been using for years that, like I mentioned before, we can't move to another account, we can create that policy relationship so that the application can access that bucket in the old account. So the application ends up getting kind of a sandbox in its own account where it can create, manage, use whatever resources it wants within reason. And then breaking out of that sandbox is an explicit policy decision that we can make along with the application owners to enable what they need for their business purposes.
Yeah, and Ashish, to address one other part of your question, as a big plus one to everything that Patrick said, another critical control that we have is, even though we have the ability to inject, arbitrary role credentials onto the host for a given application, we scope it so that there is only one role that can be set, right? And the technical side of that is controlled by the token that Patrick was alluding to earlier. But basically, we ensure that a given application is only allowed to receive credentials for a very specific remote IAM role. So
awesome.
we don't have yet.
Yeah, because I think that it's a great answer. And I think the follow-up question was asked by Vineet over here as well. Is there a concept of managed identity in AWS? A pretty open-ended question, but in terms of like how you mentioned IAM proxy was the reason because your scope is limited to the account. Like things like Cognito and all the other ones, were there an options considered? Because I think when I think of managed identity in AWS, it's like IDP, like your whole SAML federated structure, which OIDC can extend to applications as well. Or versus, I don't know, anything else, which is like a standard-based authentication. Why not go down that path?
Sure. I don't really know for sure, but I'll kind of talk about some of our considerations and landing on what we did. So there are things like AWS SSO, or sorry, it's not AWS SSO anymore.
Identity Center.
IAM Identity Center, formerly
right.
AWS SSO. So that can be used, but as far as I know, that's more focused on human access than on like application access like we're doing. Another new capability that we looked at really deeply and are kind of still looking at is IAM roles anywhere, which is a really cool way that you can use X509 certs. So, your typical PKI certs to create a session to get credentials for an IAM role. There were some limitations to that, like the session length and some of the rate limits were kind of concerning to us, but it's a new service and it's something that they're working on really actively. So I think that it could be a viable solution for us in the future.
Awesome. Thank you. And hopefully that answers your question as well, Vineet. I think throughout the conversation we've had so far, you kind of alluded to the part where you mentioned developer experience as well. And you mentioned the fact that you don't want a lot of things to change for the application side. I guess, how do you both describe developer experience and why is it important? Like, why? I mean, I'm going to quote Patrick here. Why should we care? No pun into your last name, Joseph, by the way.
Nice.
So if you're an AWS security engineer, you probably spend a huge portion of your time worried about IAM because the IAM service ends up controlling who has access to what. Misconfigured IAM policies result in massive, risk exposure. And at the same time, it's often IAM policies and resource policies that end up getting in developers' way. And poorly managed AWS IAM is a tremendous pain point for anyone actually trying to get work done. And as the stewards of IAM at Netflix, we try to be very, very empathetic to that. It feels really bad when what's stopping you from making progress as a developer or a user of the cloud within an organization is something as mundane as an IAM policy that's not letting you do your job. And so when it comes to developer experience, from where we sit, that's probably the lever that we have the most control over and where we can exercise the most leverage. There are a lot of other things that play into developer experience, but for our roles specifically, that's kind of the really big one.
That's a really well put overview. I think that one additional point I would add is that kind of our philosophy of security at Netflix is guardrails over gates. We don't want to be the team blocking somebody from getting their work done because that makes a lot of work for us and it frustrates our developers. So if we can create a safe sandbox, to use the word that I used earlier, for our developers to play in, then they don't have to come to us to ask if we can give them access to this service. They can just do it. And there are cases where if they need to break outside of that sandbox, they'll need to come to us or use like a self-service flow or something like that. But yeah, so I think that user experience or developer experience and ease of migration, which is also kind of tied into developer experience, were two of the primary considerations for how we decided to approach this. And I'm really happy with how it's turned out because we're asking for almost no work from our developers to accomplish this migration.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a huge plus point as well, because I think that's where most security solutions fail. And we kind of touched on this whole marketing thing before. It's easy to implement a tool, but then, no developer accepts it, and you're like, basically, you don't have information to work with. So
Right.
definitely a much better place to be, where you still get what you need, but without having to just change a lot of them. In the last minute that we have, I wanted to kind of ask a question around, because we get a lot of questions around, what do cloud security engineers use? This is for people who are probably new in the field, they would look at Joseph and Patrick and go, Patrick is pretending to be a security person. But so for people who are looking to pretend to be a cloud security person in the future, where somehow they are knowledgeable, but they still pretend to be, I'm not security. What do cloud security engineers normally do? And because I think it's such a broad role in a lot of organizations, means many things for many people. But generally, how do you describe what cloud security engineers do as the last thing?
Yeah, man, that's a good question. So I would say that looking at our team and like kind of how we operate, one of the most consistent traits I see is curiosity, and people just wanting to know how things work, wanting to make things better, and along with that, being just like really, really intimately familiar with the risky parts of our environment. And those two things together, if we're trying to be more aware of risk and drive down that risk in a way that's good for our developers, and we can do that with curiosity and empathy, then it just creates this, I don't know, magic that makes our team so fun to work on.
I think a lot of what Patrick said are some of the most enjoyable parts about being a security engineer. If I had to take a more like dictionary type approach, I'd say that, cloud security engineers are an enablement function. They enable their organizations to use the cloud in a way that furthers their business objectives without taking on undue risk. And that encompasses so many things, right? It encompasses knowledge of infrastructure engineering and architecture, right? Oftentimes, cloud security engineers are involved in systems design. How do we architect these systems so that they're built in a secure way? It encompasses a lot of software development work, writing security tooling, building detections, so many things. As an organization gets bigger, like with Netflix, our team has the luxury of being a little bit more specialized. We're able to spend a lot of time specifically in the IAM space, and in the cloud resource management space. Focus a lot on initiatives related to those two problem areas, as well as greater architectural problems with the cloud in general. So what an organization wants from a cloud security engineer can vary dramatically, but I will say that for the cloud security engineers that we all look up to, one of their greatest traits is flexibility, and that curiosity that Patrick just mentioned, always being willing and able to get into whatever the problem is, figure it out, and get the job done.
Yeah,
Awesome.
absolutely.
Well, this clearly experience talking over here, Patrick. I think you and I just basically like, oh my God, Joseph, you're so awesome. But I think that was pretty much like the tail end. But I think that's pretty much what we have the time for. And where can people find you?
I'm on the Fediverse. I'm Patrick Sanders at infosec.exchange. So look me up there.
God, is that still a thing?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Or are you the only person there who's just like, hi guys, I'm not security, but I just want to say hi?
There are dozens of us.
It's a great people, you know that, right?
Yeah, it's a great community.
Oh, okay, cool. I'll put the link in there as well. Joseph, what about yourself, man? Where can people connect with you?
Yeah, also on there.
Oh my God.
Joseph Exchange. Also on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Obviously it can be hard to keep up with all the messages and things on there, but if it's related to this, I'll do my best to get back to you.
Yeah, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention the Cloud Security Forum Slack workspace.
Yes.
It's a really great place. So if you want an invite, get in contact with me, and also the Forward CloudSec conference, which I am an organizer for this year. So yeah, come
Now we
hang out.
definitely sound like a cult now. When you say it like that, it's like, now we definitely sound like a cult. We have a group, we have a Slack forum, we have a conference that we run. Like,
Yeah.
But I definitely would give a shout out to Forward CloudSec as well as the Cloud Security Forum. That's been really valuable. And as Patrick mentioned, feel free to reach out either to me or to Patrick, and we'll be happy to add you to that group as well, as long as you want to provide value to people who are there. It's
Yes.
a non-spammy, non-scammy kind of place as well. So definitely join that in. But I just want to say thank you to both of you for coming on the show. Really appreciate the conversation. I think there's another conversation in here somewhere, which I'm pretty sure we can peel out for a future episode.
That'd be
thank
great.
you so much for your time, and looking forward to having you boys again.
Thank you so much for having us. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks, Ashish.
No problem. All right. Thanks, everyone. I'll see you next episode.